When Jesus declared, "I and the Father are one," he was not claiming a privilege reserved for himself alone. He was revealing the fundamental truth of your own being, a truth that has been hidden in plain sight for 2,000 years. This statement is not theology. It is the master key to spiritual healing, abundance, and inner peace that transforms everything. Most people hear these words and think Jesus was speaking only of his unique relationship with God. But Joel Goldsmith understood what the mystics have always known. Jesus was teaching the universal principle of identity. He was showing you that the same infinite consciousness that flowed through him flows through you right now, in this very moment, without exception. The tragedy is that humanity has worshipped the man instead of practicing the principle. We have made Jesus exceptional rather than exemplary. We have placed him on a pedestal so high that his teachings became unreachable. But today you are going to discover what happens when you truly understand what he meant, and your life will never be the same again. The phrase, "I and the Father are one," is not a statement about Jesus, the person walking the dusty roads of Galilee. The I he spoke of is not the human form, the body, or the personality. It is the divine consciousness, the infinite, invisible presence that he recognized as his true identity. When you understand this distinction, everything in your spiritual life shifts dramatically. Joel Goldsmith spent decades helping people realize this truth through his teachings and writings. He taught that the moment you recognize your oneness with the Father, you are no longer living as a separate human being hoping for divine intervention from somewhere outside yourself. You are living as the very presence of God expressing itself in human form. Consider what this means practically in your daily experience. When you say, "I am," you are speaking the name of God revealed to Moses in the burning bush. Every time you declare your true identity, you are invoking infinite power, wisdom, and supply. But if you follow "I am" with limitation like "I am sick" or "I am poor," you deny your oneness with the Father. Here is what begins to happen when this realization takes root in your consciousness and transforms your experience. First, you stop begging God for things as if the divine were separate from you and withholding good. You recognize that the Father's infinite abundance is already the substance of your being, closer than your breath, nearer than your hands and feet. Second, you lose the fear of lack, disease, and death that has controlled humanity for millennia. These things seem real only when you believe you are a separate mortal being disconnected from your source. But when you realize "I and the Father are one," you understand that infinite life is your true nature. Nothing can be added to you, and nothing can be taken away from you. Third, your prayers change completely from begging to recognition, from pleading to resting in truth. You no longer ask God to heal you because you realize there is no separation between you and the healing presence. You simply recognize what is already true. Wholeness, completeness, and perfection are your spiritual reality, and this recognition becomes the healing itself. Joel Goldsmith called this understanding Christ consciousness, and it is not reserved for saints or mystics alone. It is your birthright, your true identity that has been waiting for you to claim it. When Jesus said, "The kingdom of God is within you," he was pointing to this exact realization. The infinite is not distant. It is the very consciousness reading these words right now. But here is where most spiritual seekers make a critical mistake that blocks their progress entirely. They try to become one with God through effort, meditation techniques, or moral perfection. They believe oneness is something they must achieve in the future. This is impossible because oneness is not a goal. It is already the fact of your being established before the world began. You cannot become what you already are. You can only recognize it, accept it, and live from it consciously. This recognition is what Jesus demonstrated throughout his ministry. He did not heal people by asking God for special favors. He recognized the truth of their being, the oneness that disease and limitation could not touch, and that recognition dissolved the appearance of separation. Let me share what happened to a woman named Margaret who studied with Joel Goldsmith for 3 years before this truth finally broke through her intellectual understanding. She had been suffering from a chronic illness that doctors could not diagnose or cure. She prayed daily, attended every spiritual lecture, read every mystical text, yet nothing changed in her condition. One morning during meditation, she stopped asking God to heal her body. She stopped affirming health or denying disease. Instead, she simply rested in the statement, I and the Father are one. Not as a repetition or mantra, but as a deep recognition of what was already true. In that moment of pure recognition without effort or agenda, something shifted in her consciousness. Within 2 weeks, every symptom had disappeared completely, and they never returned. Her doctors were baffled, but Margaret understood what had happened. She had stopped trying to fix a sick mortal and recognized her true identity as the infinite expression of divine life. The illness was not healed. The illusion of separation was dissolved, and health was simply the natural state revealed. Another student, a businessman named Robert, faced bankruptcy after his company collapsed during an economic downturn. He had been practicing affirmations for prosperity, visualizing abundance, doing everything the success teachers told him to do. Nothing worked. His debt grew deeper, and desperation consumed him daily as creditors demanded payment. Then, Robert attended one of Joel's classes where he heard this teaching about oneness. At first, he resisted it because it seemed too simple, too abstract for his concrete financial crisis, but desperation made him willing to try anything. He began each day not by worrying about money or visualizing checks, but by recognizing, I and the Father are one, therefore infinite supply is my nature. Over the next 6 months, opportunities appeared that he could never have planned or predicted. A former colleague offered him a partnership. An unexpected inheritance came from a distant relative. New clients appeared seemingly out of nowhere. Within a year, Robert was not only debt-free, but more prosperous than before. The difference was that now he understood the source of his supply was consciousness itself, not circumstances. A third example comes from a mother whose teenage son had been arrested for drug possession and was facing serious jail time. She was consumed with fear, guilt, and helplessness. She blamed herself, blamed her ex-husband, blamed society. Her prayers were desperate pleas for God to intervene and fix her son, to change the judge's mind, to make the problem disappear magically. Joel Goldsmith taught her something radical that challenged everything she believed about prayer and healing. He told her to stop seeing her son as a troubled teenager who needed saving. Instead, recognize the truth of his being, that he too is one with the Father, that his true identity is divine consciousness, not the mistakes or the addiction or the legal trouble. For weeks she practiced this recognition in silence, not trying to change her son, but resting in the truth of what he really was beneath all appearances. Gradually, her son began to change from within. He entered rehabilitation willingly, took responsibility for his actions, and the judge showed unexpected mercy. The external circumstances shifted because the mother's consciousness had shifted first from fear to recognition of oneness. These stories reveal a pattern that Joel Goldsmith observed throughout his decades of spiritual healing work. When people stop trying to demonstrate things and instead recognize their oneness with infinite consciousness, transformation happens naturally. The form it takes may vary, but the principle remains constant. Recognition of truth dissolves the appearance of separation and limitation. This is not positive thinking or mental manipulation. This is not about convincing yourself that problems do not exist. It is about recognizing what exists beyond the level of problem and solution. When you truly understand I and the Father are one, you are not fixing a broken reality. You are waking up from the dream of separation into the truth that has always been. The question is not whether this principle works. The question is whether you are willing to let go of your limited sense of self and recognize the infinite as your true identity. This requires a death of sorts, not physical death, but the death of the belief that you are a small, separate, vulnerable person at the mercy of circumstances beyond your control. If these transformation stories resonate with your heart and inspire your spiritual journey, like this video to help others discover Joel Goldsmith's wisdom, subscribe for more mystical Christianity teachings, and comment below. Which story touched you most deeply and why? Now let us explore practical techniques that help you live from this recognition of oneness throughout your day. The first technique Joel Goldsmith taught is what he called the practice of the presence. This is not complicated. It is simply pausing throughout your day to remember, the infinite is here, now, as the very consciousness I am. Not somewhere else, not in the future, but here. When you wake in the morning, before your feet touch the floor, take 30 seconds to recognize, I and the Father are one. not as words to achieve something, but as acknowledgement of what is already true. Let this recognition set the tone for your entire day. You are not a limited person hoping to connect with God. You are the presence of God awakening to itself in human form. During challenging moments at work, in relationships, or facing difficult decisions, pause again. Do not immediately react from fear or ego. Take a breath and remember your true identity. From this recognition, wisdom flows naturally. Solutions appear that the anxious human mind could never conceive. This is not magic. This is the natural intelligence of infinite consciousness operating through you when you stop blocking it with false identity. The second technique is what Joel called releasing the mental image. Every problem you face exists first as a mental image in your consciousness. You have a picture of yourself as sick, poor, alone, or inadequate. This mental image is what needs to dissolve, not the external circumstance. The circumstance is only the outer reflection of the inner image you hold. When you recognize I and the Father are one, you are releasing the mental image of yourself as a limited mortal. You are not trying to improve that image or make it better. You are letting it go completely and resting in your true identity as infinite consciousness. This is why affirmations often fail. They are trying to improve the false image rather than releasing it entirely. Practice this now with whatever challenge you face. Stop trying to solve it on the level of the problem. Stop trying to be a better version of your limited self. Instead, release the entire mental image of yourself as the one with the problem. Recognize that the real you, the I that is one with the Father, has no problem to solve because it is already complete, whole, and infinite. The third technique Joel taught is living by grace, not effort. When you understand your oneness with the Father, you realize that the infinite is living your life, not you. The divine intelligence that created galaxies and orchestrates nature is the same intelligence breathing your body, beating your heart, and guiding your path. You do not have to make things happen through struggle and force. This does not mean you become passive or lazy. It means you stop acting from anxiety and start acting from inspiration. You listen for the inner prompting, the gentle guidance that comes from recognizing yourself as the instrument through which infinite wisdom flows. Your actions become effortless because they arise from alignment with your true nature rather than from desperate human effort. Joel often said, "Do not try to demonstrate supply, health, or harmony. Let the Father demonstrate itself as these things through you." This shift from doing to allowing is the key. You are not the creator. You are the channel through which the Creator expresses. When you try to be the creator, you exhaust yourself. When you recognize yourself as the channel, infinite energy flows through you without depletion. The fourth practice is maintaining what Joel called the altitude of consciousness. Your state of consciousness determines what you experience in the outer world. When you live from the recognition I and the Father are one, you are living at a high altitude where storms cannot reach you. Problems that devastate others cannot touch the consciousness that knows its oneness with the infinite. This altitude is not maintained through constant effort or vigilance. It is maintained through regular periods of silence and recognition. Joel recommended at least 2 periods daily where you withdraw from the world and rest in conscious oneness. Not to get something or achieve something, but simply to remember what is true. These periods of silence recharge your consciousness and keep you living from truth rather than appearances. During these silent times, do not fill your mind with words, affirmations, or requests. Simply be still and recognize the presence that you are. Let thoughts come and go without engaging them. Rest in the I am that needs nothing, seeks nothing, and lacks nothing. This is not meditation technique. This is conscious communion with your own true nature as one with the Father. But let us be honest about the challenges you will face in living this truth, because Joel Goldsmith never sugar-coated the spiritual path. The first major obstacle is doubt. Your human mind will constantly question whether this oneness is really true. Every problem that appears will seem like evidence that you are separate, limited, and vulnerable. This doubt is natural and expected. Joel taught that doubt is not your enemy. It is simply the old consciousness resisting its own dissolution. When doubt arises, do not fight it or feel guilty about it. simply return to recognition. I and the Father are one is not something you must believe. It is something you recognize as true despite what appearances suggest. Faith is not blind belief. Faith is loyalty to truth even when circumstances seem to contradict it. The second obstacle is impatience. You may practice this recognition for days or weeks and see no change in your circumstances. The human mind wants instant results, immediate proof. But consciousness transformation does not work on human timelines. Joel often said it took him years of practice before this truth became his living experience, rather than just an intellectual concept he understood. The third challenge is the influence of mass consciousness. You live in a world where billions of people believe in separation, limitation, and fear. This collective belief is powerful. It bombards you daily through media, conversations, and cultural conditioning. Even when you have moments of clear recognition, the weight of mass consciousness can pull you back into forgetfulness and doubt. Joel taught that you cannot change mass consciousness, but you can protect yourself from its influence. This requires vigilance, not in fighting against negativity, but in consciously choosing which consciousness you will accept as yours. When world news triggers fear, pause and remember, I and the Father are one. Therefore, I live in a different universe than the one presented by fearful appearances. This is not denial or avoiding reality. This is recognizing which reality is true. The world of separation, conflict, and limitation is the false reality created by collective human belief. The world of oneness, harmony, and infinite supply is the true reality created by divine consciousness. You choose which world you inhabit by the consciousness you maintain throughout your day. The fourth obstacle is the tendency to use this truth as a technique to get things rather than as a revelation of what you already are. Many people hear, I and the Father are one, and immediately think, great, now I can use this to manifest money, heal my body, or attract my soulmate. This completely misses the point and blocks the very transformation you seek. Joel was very clear about this pitfall. He said that the moment you try to use spiritual truth for personal gain, you have lost the truth entirely. You have made God a servant to your human desires, rather than recognizing that the human you think you are does not even exist. There is only God, expressing as infinite forms, and you are one of those forms. When you truly understand I and the Father are one, you stop wanting things because you recognize you already are everything. The desire for more money implies lack. The desire for health implies disease. The desire for love implies loneliness. But the consciousness that knows its oneness with infinite fullness has no desires. It simply lives, expresses, and allows divine will to unfold perfectly. The fifth challenge is what Joel called taking thought, which means mentally planning, worrying, and trying to figure out how things will work. The human mind is addicted to control. It wants to know the plan, see the path, and manage the details. But living from oneness requires releasing mental control completely and trusting the intelligence that governs all creation. This does not mean you stop thinking or making practical decisions. It means you stop anxious thinking, fearful planning, and trying to manipulate outcomes. When you need to make a decision, you quiet your mind and listen for inner guidance. The answer comes not from analyzing pros and cons, but from the still small voice of infinite wisdom that knows exactly what is needed in every moment. Joel taught a simple practice for this. When faced with a decision, do not immediately engage your thinking mind. First, recognize your oneness with infinite intelligence. Wait in silence until you feel a sense of rightness about a particular direction. Then act on that inner knowing without second-guessing it. This is living by grace rather than by the mental gymnastics of the separated human mind. If these practical challenges and solutions are helping you break through spiritual obstacles, like this video to support transformative content. Subscribe for advanced Joel Goldsmith teachings, and comment. Which obstacle resonates most with your current journey? Now let us explore how this recognition of oneness transforms specific areas of your life in ways that may surprise you. First, your relationship with money and supply changes completely when you understand that abundance is not something you get from the world. It is something that flows through you from the infinite consciousness that you are one with, expressing as every form of good. A student of Joel's was a schoolteacher earning a modest salary, constantly worried about making ends meet. She practiced recognizing her oneness with infinite supply daily, not to get more money, but to realize that her source was consciousness, not her paycheck. Within months, she inherited property from a relative she barely knew. Then her school district offered her a prestigious position with double her previous salary. But the real transformation was not in the increased income. It was in her complete freedom from financial anxiety. She knew with absolute certainty that regardless of circumstances, the infinite would always express as whatever was needed, because she and the infinite were one. This inner knowing made her magnetic to opportunities that were invisible to consciousness, still believing in lack and separation. Your relationships transform dramatically when you recognize that the people in your life are not separate beings who can withhold love or approval from you. They are expressions of the one infinite consciousness, just as you are. When you stop seeking fulfillment from others and recognize your oneness with infinite love, your relationships shift from needy transactions to free expressions of shared divinity. One man had been divorced 3 times, each relationship ending in bitterness and blame. He met Joel at a lecture and learned this principle of oneness. For the first time, he stopped looking for a woman to complete him and instead recognized his completeness in oneness with the Father. He spent a year in this recognition without seeking any relationship at all. Then he met someone, but this time the relationship was completely different. There was no neediness, no fear of loss, no attempts to change or control the other person. Both individuals were whole, expressing their oneness with the infinite and choosing to share that expression together. The relationship thrived not because they needed each other, but because they were free to love without the burden of incompleteness. Your physical health transforms when you stop believing your body is a material object subject to disease, decay, and death. Joel taught that your body is consciousness made visible, the outer form of the infinite life that you are. When you recognize I and the Father are one, you realize that infinite life is your only life, and that life knows no disease or limitation. A woman diagnosed with a supposedly incurable condition attended Joel's classes regularly. She stopped all medical treatment, not out of rebellion, but out of deep recognition that her true life was spiritual and eternal. Every day she affirmed not as a mental exercise, but as recognition of fact. The life I live is the life of the Father. Infinite life is expressing as this body, and infinite life knows no disease. Over 18 months, her symptoms gradually disappeared, and eventual medical tests showed no trace of the disease. Her doctors called it spontaneous remission. She called it recognition of truth. The body had not been healed. The false belief that her life was mortal and material had been dissolved, and health was simply the natural expression of infinite life that had always been present. Your work and life purpose transform when you stop believing you must find your purpose or create success through human effort. Joel taught that infinite consciousness already has a plan for its own expression through you. Your only job is to recognize your oneness and allow that divine plan to unfold without interference from human ambition, fear, or control. One young artist struggled for years trying to make a living from his paintings, constantly rejected by galleries and ignored by critics. He was ready to quit and get a regular job when someone introduced him to Joel's teachings. He began practicing recognition of his oneness with infinite creativity. He stopped painting to please galleries or critics and simply allowed infinite creativity to express through him. Within a year, his work began attracting attention from unexpected sources. A prominent collector discovered him through a small local exhibition. Commissions began flowing, but more importantly, he found joy in the creative process itself because he was no longer creating from ego or need. He was the instrument through which infinite beauty expressed itself, and that expression naturally attracted its perfect channels of distribution and appreciation. As you live daily from this recognition of oneness, you begin to notice something profound happening in your consciousness. The things that used to disturb you no longer have power over you. The opinions of others, the fluctuations of circumstances, the threats of the world lose their ability to shake your inner foundation. You have found the rock upon which Christ told you to build your house. This is not because you have become cold or indifferent. You still engage with life fully, perhaps more fully than before, but you engage from a different place. You engage as the infinite expressing temporarily in human form, rather than as a frightened mortal hoping to survive and thrive in a hostile world. This shift in identity changes everything about how you experience each moment. Joel called this state living in the secret place of the Most High. It is a consciousness that knows itself as one with God, therefore untouchable by anything that belongs to the world of appearances. Problems still arise, challenges still appear, but they cannot penetrate the consciousness that rests in recognized oneness. They are like storms that rage on the surface while the depths remain eternally still and peaceful. You also discover that the more you live from this recognition, the less you feel the need to convince others or defend your beliefs. Truth needs no defense. When you know your oneness with the Father, you have nothing to prove. You simply live your life as a witness to that truth, and those who are ready will recognize it without any persuasion from you. This eliminates the exhausting need to argue, convince, or convert anyone to your way of seeing. Joel taught that consciousness is not changed by words or arguments. It is changed by recognition. When you live from oneness, you carry a vibration that others can feel even if they cannot articulate it. Some will be drawn to you and want to know your secret. Others will resist or reject you. Either response is perfect. Your only responsibility is to maintain your own recognition of truth. You are not here to save the world or fix anyone else. You are here to recognize your oneness with the Father and allow that recognition to dissolve any appearance of separation in your own experience. As you do this, you become a light in the darkness, not through preaching or teaching, but through being what you truly are. There comes a moment in this practice when intellectual understanding becomes living experience. Joel described it as a shift that cannot be explained, only known. You are no longer trying to believe I and the Father are one. You simply know it with a knowing that requires no external validation or proof. This knowing becomes the foundation of your entire existence. When this shift happens, prayer becomes entirely different. You do not pray to change God's mind or get God to do something. You pray simply to recognize what is already true. Your prayer becomes, reveal to me the truth of this situation. Show me what is real beyond the appearance. And in the silence that follows, truth reveals itself not as words, but as knowing, as peace, as the dissolution of whatever seemed to be a problem. This is what Jesus meant when he said, "My peace I give to you, not as the world gives." The peace the world offers is temporary, dependent on circumstances being favorable. The peace that comes from recognizing your oneness with the Father is permanent, independent of any circumstance. It is the peace of knowing who you really are, beyond all the false identities that the world has taught you to embrace. So here is what happens when you truly understand what Jesus meant by I and the Father are one. You stop living as a separate fragment hoping to connect with something greater. You recognize yourself as the very presence of infinite consciousness expressing in this particular time and space. You realize that every quality of God is your quality because there is no separation. This recognition does not make you arrogant or superior to others. It makes you humble because you realize you can take no credit for anything. The infinite is living your life. You are simply the transparency through which it shines. Your only task is to remain clear, to not block the light with false beliefs, fears, and limitations that arise from the illusion of separation. Joel Goldsmith spent his life teaching this one truth in countless ways. You are not separate from God. You are not distant from the kingdom. You are not waiting to become spiritual. You are already the fullness of infinite consciousness expressing itself. The moment you recognize this, your search ends and your real life begins. Not the life of striving and becoming, but the life of being and expressing what you have always been. If your understanding of Jesus' deepest teaching has been transformed through these Joel Goldsmith insights, like this video now, subscribe for more mystical wisdom, and comment, I am one with the Father, to claim this truth as your living reality.
Imagine living your entire life in a prison without bars. You wake up, go about your day, interact with others, and yet you're not truly free. The walls aren't made of concrete, they're constructed from beliefs, fears, and illusions you've accepted as reality. Now, imagine discovering the key that unlocks every door, breaks every chain, and reveals a world you never knew existed. That key is truth. The truth will set you free. These 6 words, spoken over 2,000 years ago, contain a power that most people never fully grasp. We've heard this phrase so many times, it's become background noise, a nice sentiment, a motivational quote, perhaps something you'd see on a coffee mug. But when you truly understand what this means, when you experience the seismic shift that occurs in your consciousness, everything changes. This isn't about religion, though the phrase originates from the Bible. This is about a fundamental principle of human existence that transcends any single belief system. It's about the moment when you stop running from reality and instead turn to face it directly. It's about the liberation that comes not from changing your circumstances, but from seeing them clearly for the first time. What happens when you understand this truth? You don't just learn something new, you undergo a metamorphosis. The person you were begins to dissolve, and the person you were always meant to be emerges. Let's explore this profound transformation together, because understanding this principle might be the most important thing you ever do. Decoding the ancient wisdom. When Jesus said the truth will set you free in John 8:32, he wasn't speaking in abstract philosophical terms. The full context reveals something crucial. If you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. The people listening responded, "We are Abraham's descendants and have never been slaves to anyone. How can you say that we shall be set free?" Their confusion is telling. They thought he was talking about physical slavery, about political oppression or social bondage. But Jesus clarified, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. He was talking about a different kind of prison entirely, one that exists within the human mind and spirit. The truth that sets you free isn't simply factual accuracy or correct information. It's not about knowing more facts or winning arguments. The truth that liberates is a deep, experiential understanding of reality as it actually is, not as we wish it to be or fear it might be. It's the truth about yourself, about the nature of existence, about the patterns that govern your life, and about the lies you've been living under. Think of truth as light and lies as darkness. When you live in darkness, you stumble, you misjudge distances, you fear what might be lurking in the corners. You create elaborate stories about what's out there based on limited information and past trauma. But when light floods in, suddenly everything becomes clear. The monster in the corner is just a coat rack. The insurmountable obstacle is just a small hurdle. The prison walls you felt closing in were merely shadows projected by your own fears. This kind of truth operates on multiple levels. There's the truth about external reality, seeing situations, people, and circumstances as they actually are, rather than through the distorted lens of your biases and conditioning. There's the truth about yourself, acknowledging your authentic nature, your real motivations, your actual capabilities, instead of the self-image you've constructed. And there's the truth about the underlying patterns and principles that govern life, understanding how cause and effect work in the realm of human psychology and relationships. When you begin to understand truth in this comprehensive way, you realize that most of human suffering comes from one source: resistance to what is. We suffer not primarily from our circumstances, but from our inability or unwillingness to see them clearly and accept reality as it presents itself. We create elaborate fiction about who we should be, what should happen, how others should behave, and then we suffer when reality refuses to conform to our script. The freedom that truth brings is the freedom from this exhausting struggle against reality. It's the liberation that comes from finally putting down the heavy burden of pretense, denial, and self-deception. It's the relief of no longer having to maintain the complex architecture of lies we tell ourselves and others. The prisons we don't see. Before we can understand the liberation, we need to see the chains. Most people walk through life bound by invisible constraints they don't even recognize as constraints. These prisons are so familiar, so normalized, that we mistake them for reality itself. Consider the prison of false identity. From childhood, you've been building an image of who you are, based on other people's opinions, social expectations, past experiences, and defense mechanisms. This constructed self becomes like armor, protective, but also confining. You tell yourself stories. I'm not good enough. I'm not the type of person who does that. I always fail at relationships. I'm not creative. I'm too old to change. These narratives become self-fulfilling prophecies, creating bars around your potential. Then there's the prison of fear. Fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of being truly seen. These fears dictate countless decisions. You don't apply for the job because you might not get it. You don't express your feelings because you might be rejected. You don't pursue your dreams because you might fail. You conform to expectations because you might be criticized if you stand out. Fear becomes a cage that shrinks year by year until you can barely move. There's also the prison of other people's expectations. From an early age, you absorbed messages about what you should be, what you should want, what constitutes success, what makes you valuable. Parents, teachers, society, media, all impose their blueprints on your life, and somewhere along the way, you forgot to ask, is this what I actually want, or what I was told to want? Many people climb their whole lives up a ladder only to reach the top and discover it was leaning against the wrong wall. The prison of the past is particularly powerful. Past traumas, failures, embarrassments, and losses become like ghosts that haunt your present. You make today's decisions based on yesterday's wounds. Someone hurt you in a relationship 10 years ago, and you're still protecting yourself from that person in every new relationship you enter. You failed at something once, and now you avoid that entire category of experience. The past, which no longer exists except in memory, somehow controls your present reality. Perhaps the most subtle prison is the one built from comfortable lies. These are the falsehoods we embrace because truth feels too threatening or demanding. The lie that your circumstances are entirely beyond your control absolves you of responsibility, but also strips you of power. The lie that you're fundamentally flawed explains your struggles but prevents growth. The lie that everyone else has it figured out protects you from feeling inadequate but isolates you from genuine connection. We also imprison ourselves with unexpressed emotions. Every feeling you've suppressed, every truth you've swallowed, every authentic response you've denied creates a kind of psychic debt. These repressed emotions don't disappear. They build up like pressure in a sealed container, influencing your behavior in ways you don't understand. They emerge as anxiety, depression, anger, or physical symptoms. The body keeps the score, and the price of inauthenticity is high. Living in these prisons has real costs. You make yourself smaller to fit into boxes that were never designed for you. You silence your voice to avoid conflict. You numb yourself with distractions to avoid feeling the discomfort of your constrained existence. You sacrifice your dreams on the altar of should and must. And perhaps most tragically, you never discover who you truly are beneath all the conditioning because you never create space for that authentic self to emerge. Why we fear the truth. If truth is so liberating, why do we resist it so fiercely? Why do we cling to our comfortable illusions even when they cause us pain? Understanding this resistance is crucial because it's the primary obstacle between you and your freedom. First, truth often requires us to admit we were wrong. There's a psychological concept called cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable tension that arises when we hold conflicting beliefs or when our beliefs clash with reality. To resolve this discomfort, we often engage in motivated reasoning, twisting facts and logic to defend our existing worldview rather than updating it. Admitting error feels like admitting weakness, especially in a culture that values certainty and confidence. But ironically, the ability to say, "I was wrong," is actually a sign of strength and wisdom. Truth also threatens our identity. We've invested years, sometimes decades, building a particular self-image. We've told ourselves stories about who we are, and these stories have become comfortable even when they're limiting. Confronting truth might mean acknowledging that the person you thought you were is largely a fiction. This can feel like a death because, in a sense, it is. The ego must die for the authentic self to emerge, and the ego fights for its survival with every tool at its disposal. There's also the fear of what truth might demand of us. If you acknowledge the truth about an unhealthy relationship, you might have to leave it. If you admit the truth about your career dissatisfaction, you might have to change paths. If you recognize the truth about your potential, you might have to actually try, which means risking failure. Ignorance in this sense provides plausible deniability. You can't be held responsible for what you don't know. Truth strips away this excuse and places the burden of choice squarely on your shoulders. We fear the pain that truth might bring. Some truths hurt the truth about loss, mortality, human nature, our limitations. We'd rather live in denial than face painful realities. We tell ourselves stories to soften harsh facts. We avoid doctors because we're afraid of a diagnosis. We don't check our bank balance because we're scared of what we'll find. We stay busy to avoid confronting the emptiness we feel. This avoidance is understandable, but it comes at a cost. The pain we avoid doesn't disappear. It just operates unconsciously, shaping our lives from the shadows. There's also a social cost to truth. Honesty can threaten relationships built on mutual pretense. Speaking your truth might alienate family members, friends, or colleagues who are invested in maintaining certain illusions. There's enormous social pressure to go along with consensus reality, to not make waves, to keep uncomfortable truths to yourself. Being the one who points out that the emperor has no clothes is lonely and often punished. Finally, we fear the unknown. Our lies and illusions are familiar, they're predictable. Even when they cause suffering, they're the suffering we know. Truth leads us into uncharted territory. Who will you be if you're not who you thought you were? What will your life look like if you stop pretending? Where will you go if you leave the familiar prison? The unknown feels dangerous even when the known is painful. The transformation begins. But what happens when you finally stop running? What occurs in that crucial moment when you decide to face truth head-on, regardless of the cost? This is where the real magic happens, where everything begins to shift. The transformation typically begins with a moment of clarity, sometimes gentle, sometimes catastrophic. It might come through a crisis that shatters your illusions. A relationship ends, a health scare strikes, a career collapses, a loved one dies. Or it might come through quiet revelation, a book that resonates, a conversation that cuts through your defenses, a moment of stillness where truth whispers to you undeniably. However it arrives, this moment of truth realization creates a fracture in the edifice of your constructed reality. And through that crack, light begins to pour in. You see, perhaps for the first time, how you've been lying to yourself. You recognize the patterns you've been running, the ways you've been betraying your authentic self, the chains you've been wearing voluntarily. This initial realization is rarely comfortable. In fact, it's often accompanied by what spiritual traditions call the dark night of the soul, a period of intense disorientation, grief, even despair. Everything you thought you knew about yourself and your life is called into question. The familiar landmarks disappear. You feel lost, vulnerable, sometimes completely broken. But here's what's actually happening. The false self is dissolving. The constructed identity, the protective armor, the comfortable lies, they're falling away. This feels like death because it is death. But it's not the death of who you truly are, it's the death of who you pretended to be. And this death is necessary for rebirth. As you begin to embrace truth, you start noticing things you couldn't see before. You recognize patterns in your behavior, how you sabotage yourself in relationships, how you avoid certain challenges, how you project your issues onto others. You see your parents not as the mythological figures of childhood, but as flawed humans doing their best. You understand that the person who hurt you was acting from their own pain, not from your unworthiness. This seeing is liberating because it removes you from the center of every narrative. Not everything that happens is about you. People's behavior reflects their inner world more than it reflects your value. Failure doesn't make you a failure, it makes you human. You begin to develop what psychologists call metacognition, the ability to observe your own thinking, to recognize when you're caught in unhelpful patterns, to gently redirect yourself toward truth. With this awareness comes a new kind of power, the power of choice. When you see your patterns clearly, you're no longer unconsciously enslaved to them. When you recognize a limiting belief in action, you can question it. When you notice yourself falling into old fears, you can choose differently. Truth doesn't just show you your chains, it also shows you the key has been in your hand all along. You start making different decisions. You say no to things that don't align with your values, even when it's uncomfortable. You say yes to opportunities that scare you, but call to something authentic within you. You speak up when the old you would have stayed silent. You set boundaries where previously you had none. You pursue dreams you dismissed as impossible. Relationships transform dramatically. When you stop pretending, you attract people who resonate with your authentic self rather than your performance. Shallow connections fall away, and deeper ones form. You stop trying to be what others want and start being who you are. Paradoxically, this makes you more lovable, not less, because people can finally connect with the real you rather than the mask. Your relationship with yourself fundamentally changes. The harsh inner critic begins to soften. You develop compassion for your struggles because you understand they came from pain, not from defectiveness. You forgive yourself for past mistakes because you see they came from ignorance, not from malice. You accept your humanity, both your light and your shadow, with tenderness, living in truth, practical applications. Understanding the principle intellectually is one thing, living it daily is another. How does this transformation manifest in practical, everyday life? What does it actually look like to let truth set you free? In your work life, truth-based living means pursuing what genuinely fulfills you rather than what looks impressive or pays the most. It means being honest about your skills and limitations, not inflating your competence or underselling yourself, but accurately representing your abilities. It means speaking up about problems, contributing your genuine ideas, even when they're unconventional, and declining to participate in organizational dishonesty or dysfunction. When you're aligned with truth in your work, Mondays stop being something to dread and become opportunities to engage with purpose. In relationships, truth transforms everything. You stop playing games and speak directly about your feelings, needs, and boundaries. You acknowledge when you're wrong and apologize sincerely. You express appreciation authentically. You address conflicts when they arise. Instead of letting resentment build, you let people know where they stand with you. This doesn't mean being brutally blunt or weaponizing honesty. It means being considerate and clear, respecting both yourself and others enough to be genuine. When conflicts arise, and they will, truth gives you a different approach. Instead of defending your position reflexively, you become curious about what's really happening beneath the surface. You ask yourself, what am I really afraid of here? What need am I trying to meet? What might I not be seeing? This inquiry often reveals that what seems like an interpersonal conflict is actually a collision of unexamined assumptions or unmet needs that neither party has clearly communicated. In your internal dialogue, truth-based living means paying attention to your actual thoughts and feelings without immediately judging or suppressing them. When anxiety arises, instead of pushing it away or getting lost in it, you inquire, what is this anxiety trying to tell me? What truth am I avoiding? When you feel resentment, you trace it back to its source. Where is this really coming from? What boundary did I fail to set? What expectation am I holding that reality won't meet? Financial truth is particularly powerful. Many people live in a haze of financial denial, not checking their bank balance, not tracking their spending, accumulating debt while telling themselves they're fine. When you bring truth to your finances, you look at the numbers clearly, no matter how uncomfortable. You acknowledge what you're actually spending and earning. You stop pretending expensive items are investments. You have honest conversations with partners or family members about money. This clear-eyed approach often reveals that the situation is either better than you feared or that concrete steps can improve it, but first, you have to see it clearly. Health and self-care benefit immensely from truth. You stop ignoring symptoms or warning signs. You acknowledge when you're genuinely tired versus when you're avoiding something. You recognize the difference between self-care that nourishes you and escapist numbing that depletes you. You honor your body's actual needs rather than punishing it to meet unrealistic standards or ignoring it because you're too busy. Truth-based living also transforms your consumption of information. You become more discerning about what you allow into your mind. You question narratives instead of accepting them uncritically. You seek out diverse perspectives. You acknowledge the limits of your knowledge. You become comfortable saying, I don't know, instead of defending positions you haven't examined. You recognize when you're engaging with ideas versus when you're just confirming your biases. In your creative and personal growth pursuits, truth liberates you from comparison and perfectionism. You acknowledge your current skill level honestly while holding space for growth. You pursue excellence without demanding perfection. You create for the sake of expression rather than for external validation. You measure yourself against your own standards and potential, not against someone else's highlight reel. Perhaps most importantly, truth-based living means developing a practice of regular self-inquiry. This might look like journaling, meditation, therapy, or simply setting aside time for honest reflection. You regularly ask yourself, what am I avoiding? What am I pretending not to know? Where am I betraying myself? What needs to be acknowledged or expressed? These questions, asked with genuine curiosity and compassion, keep you aligned with truth and prevent the slow drift back into comfortable delusion. The challenges of freedom. Here's what they don't tell you. Freedom is harder than bondage. Those chains were heavy, but they were also familiar. They told you who to be, what to do, how to live. When they fall away, you're faced with the magnificent and terrifying burden of choice. Newly freed people often experience a kind of vertigo. Without the old scripts, without the familiar constraints, without the comfortable lies to hide behind, you have to figure out who you actually are and what you actually want. This requires energy, courage, and constant vigilance. It's easier, in many ways, to let others make your decisions, to follow the predetermined path, to never question the narrative you inherited. You'll also discover that not everyone celebrates your liberation. People who knew you in your constrained state might feel threatened by your transformation. Your growth might highlight their stagnation. Your truth-telling might disrupt comfortable dynamics. Family members might pressure you to go back to how you were. Friends might drift away. Some people preferred the version of you that stayed small, that didn't challenge them, that played along with unspoken agreements. This can be painfully lonely. There's often a period between leaving the old life and fully establishing the new one, where you feel like you don't belong anywhere. You've outgrown your old circles but haven't yet found your new tribe. You understand yourself in ways that make previous connections feel superficial, but deep connections take time to develop. This liminal space, while necessary, can feel like exile. You'll also face your own resistance. Just because you've had a breakthrough doesn't mean you're done. The old patterns have deep grooves. You'll catch yourself falling back into familiar lies, into people-pleasing, into self-abandonment. The difference is that now you see it happening, and awareness is the first step toward change. But expect the journey to be recursive rather than linear, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, constant practice. Truth also brings responsibility. You can no longer blame others for your life. You can't hide behind, "I didn't know," or "I had no choice." When you see clearly, you're accountable for your response. This is empowering but also weighty. Every day presents choices, and you now know that you're choosing whether by action or inaction, you're authoring your life. There's also the challenge of discernment. Not every thought that pops into your head is truth. Not every feeling is a reliable guide. Not every impulse should be followed. Part of living in truth is developing the wisdom to distinguish between genuine insight and ego, between intuition and fear, between authentic expression and self-indulgent drama. This discernment is a skill that develops with practice, mistakes, and reflection. Your liberation journey. So how do you begin? If you're reading this and recognizing yourself in these descriptions, if you're feeling the stirring of something that wants to break free, what's the first step? Start with one truth, just one. Pick something you've been avoiding or denying. It doesn't have to be dramatic. In fact, starting small is often more sustainable. Maybe it's admitting you're not happy in your current job. Maybe it's acknowledging a relationship isn't working. Maybe it's recognizing a habit that's harming you. Maybe it's confessing you don't actually believe something you've been claiming to believe. Whatever it is, speak it to yourself first. Write it down. Say it aloud when you're alone. Notice what happens in your body when you acknowledge this truth. Does your chest feel lighter? Do you feel fear, relief, both? This bodily awareness is crucial. Your body often knows the truth before your mind is willing to admit it. Learn to listen to these somatic signals. They're a compass pointing toward what needs attention. Next, practice sitting with discomfort instead of immediately trying to fix or escape it. When difficult truths arise, when painful feelings emerge, resist the urge to numb out, distract yourself, or rush to resolution. Just sit, breathe, feel. Often, the truth that wants to emerge is buried beneath layers of protective distraction. Creating space for stillness allows it to surface. Find someone safe to talk to: a therapist, a wise friend, a spiritual director, anyone who can hold space for your truth without judgment or an agenda to fix you. Speaking truth aloud to another person has a power that internal acknowledgement alone doesn't have. It makes the truth real in a new way. Choose this person carefully. They should be someone who values authenticity over comfort, who can tolerate difficult conversations, who won't try to talk you out of what you know. Begin questioning your narratives. When you catch yourself thinking, "I always," or "I never," or "I can't," pause. Ask, is this actually true, or is this a story I've been telling myself? Challenge your assumptions. Where did this belief come from? Is it based on reality or on fear? Does it serve you or does it constrain you? Practice radical honesty in low-stakes situations. If someone asks how you're doing and you're not fine, try saying, "Actually, I'm struggling a bit," instead of the automatic, "Fine, thanks." If you don't like something, say so politely instead of pretending. Start with small truths, building your authenticity muscle in situations where the consequences are minimal. This practice prepares you for the harder truths that will eventually need expression. Create rituals of truth. This might be a daily journaling practice where you write 3 honest things about your day. It might be a weekly check-in with yourself where you ask, where did I compromise my integrity this week? Where was I authentic? What truth am I avoiding? It might be a meditation practice where you simply observe your thoughts without judgment, noticing what's really there beneath the surface chatter. Be prepared for the purge that often comes with truth-telling. As you become more authentic, things that aren't aligned with your truth will naturally fall away. Jobs, relationships, habits, beliefs, they'll either transform to accommodate your authentic self or they'll exit your life. This can feel like loss, and in some ways it is. But it's also making room for what's genuinely meant for you. Celebrate small victories. Each time you choose truth over comfort, acknowledge it. Each time you set a boundary, speak honestly, or show up authentically, recognize that you're building a new way of being. Change happens through repetition of new patterns, and recognition reinforces those patterns. Closing and call to action. The truth will set you free, but first, it might make you uncomfortable. It might disrupt your life. It might cost you some things you thought you needed. But what you gain is infinitely more valuable than what you lose. You gain yourself, the real you, not the performance version, not the should-be you, or the used-to-be you, or the someday might-be you, but the is, right now, you. And that person, freed from the burden of pretense and the weight of lies, is capable of things you cannot currently imagine. You gain agency. When you see clearly, you can choose consciously. You're no longer a puppet dancing to strings you can't see, no longer running programs installed by others, no longer living someone else's idea of your life. You become the author of your story, imperfect but authentic. You gain peace. Not the peace of having everything figured out or having no problems, but the peace that comes from internal alignment. When your inner world matches your outer expression, when you stop fighting reality, when you let go of maintaining elaborate fictions, a profound stillness becomes available. This peace isn't dependent on circumstances. It's a quality of being that comes from integrity, from being whole and undivided within yourself. You gain connection, real connection, the kind where souls meet rather than masks interacting. When you show up authentically, you give others permission to do the same. You create spaces where truth is welcome, where vulnerability is strength, where people can be real. These connections nourish in ways that surface relationships never can. You gain aliveness. Life in prison, even a comfortable prison, is muted. Colors are dull, experiences are filtered, emotions are dampened. But when you step into truth and freedom, everything intensifies. You feel more deeply, love more fully, experience more vividly. You're present instead of dissociated, engaged instead of numbed out, alive instead of merely existing. The journey isn't easy. Some days you'll want to crawl back into comfortable delusions. Some days the weight of freedom will feel too heavy. Some days you'll wonder if ignorance was indeed bliss. But on those days, remember this: you cannot unknow what you know. Once you've tasted truth, once you've experienced real freedom, the prison can never be comfortable again. So, here's your call to action. Start today, right now. What's one truth you've been avoiding? What's one lie you've been telling yourself? What's one area of your life where you've been settling for a comfortable fiction instead of facing reality? Speak that truth. Write it down. Acknowledge it. Don't try to fix it immediately or figure out all the implications. Just see it clearly. Because that moment, that simple, courageous moment of clear seeing, is where everything changes. The truth will set you free. But you have to be willing to look at it first. You have to be brave enough to see, honest enough to acknowledge, and committed enough to live by what you discover. Your liberation is waiting. It's always been waiting. The only question is, are you ready to claim it? The cage door has always been unlocked. You just have to be willing to see it, push it open, and walk through into the spacious freedom that is your birthright. The truth is here. The freedom is here. All that's required is your yes to seeing clearly, living authentically, and embracing the magnificent, terrifying, beautiful reality of who you actually are. What happens when you understand that the truth will set you free? Everything changes, and it starts right now with you, with one honest acknowledgement, with one brave step toward the life you were always meant to live. Are you ready?
Most people read this biblical passage and miss its revolutionary power. They think it means God will validate whatever rules we create on earth. But Joel Goldsmith discovered something far more profound that changes everything about how consciousness creates reality. This ancient wisdom holds the master key to healing, manifestation, and spiritual freedom. What you bind in consciousness becomes your lived experience, not through divine approval or external permission, but through the immutable law of consciousness itself. Your inner convictions, your accepted beliefs, your mental agreements create the conditions you experience. This is not metaphor. This is spiritual mechanics. When you bind fear in your thoughts, fear manifests in your world. When you bind limitation as truth, limitation becomes your experience. But here is the transformation secret. When you bind spiritual truth in consciousness, heaven's reality appears on earth. Not someday, not after death. Right now, in this moment, through understanding. Joel Goldsmith spent decades proving this principle through thousands of documented healings. He watched terminal illnesses dissolve. He witnessed financial impossibilities transform overnight, not through begging God or positive thinking alone, but through recognizing what consciousness was binding as real and deliberately unbinding it. The word bind means to tie, to make secure, to establish as law. Every time you accept a condition as permanent, you bind it. Every diagnosis you agree with internally, every limitation you call real, every fear you treat as fact becomes bound in your experience. Your consciousness is the binding agent, and you have been using it unconsciously your entire life. Here is what changes everything. You possess the same power to unbind. The moment you withdraw your inner agreement from any condition, you begin dissolving its hold on your reality. This is not denial. This is spiritual authority recognizing that consciousness, not matter, determines experience. Goldsmith taught that heaven is not a location, but a state of consciousness where spiritual truth reigns supreme. When you bind spiritual truth in your awareness, that heavenly state materializes as earthly demonstration. The key word is bind, meaning to establish firmly, to make it your operating conviction, your foundational reality. Most people try to change their circumstances while keeping their consciousness unchanged. They want the outer picture to shift while binding the same fears, doubts, and limitations internally. This cannot work. The outer world is effect, never cause. What you establish in consciousness must appear in experience because consciousness is the only creative power. When you truly bind the truth that God is the only power, lack loses its authority over you. When you bind the reality that spirit governs your body, disease loses its claim. When you bind your identity as spiritual consciousness rather than vulnerable flesh, the entire game changes. This is not philosophy. This is activation. The transformation begins when you stop giving power to appearances and start binding spiritual truth as your only reality. Not as affirmation you hope becomes true, but as recognition of what is already eternally true in the kingdom of consciousness. You are not creating truth. You are binding yourself to truth that already exists in its fullness. Goldsmith emphasized that this binding must happen in the secret place of consciousness, not through loud declarations or forced belief. It is the quiet, deep inner knowing that shifts everything. When you silently establish spiritual truth as your foundation, your entire experience reorganizes around that new center of gravity without effort or strain. This is why Jesus taught this principle. He knew that human beings possess the authority to bind and loose, to establish and release, through consciousness alone. Your agreement or disagreement with conditions determines their power over you. What you bind through acceptance becomes your law. What you loose through spiritual understanding loses all authority. A woman came to Goldsmith with a diagnosis the doctors called terminal. 6 months maximum. She had already accepted death, made peace with it, bound it as inevitable truth. Goldsmith did not argue with the diagnosis. He worked with her consciousness. For 3 weeks, they met daily, not to treat her body, but to unbind the conviction of death and bind the truth of eternal life. She later described the shift as sudden, yet gradual. One morning, she realized she no longer believed in the diagnosis. Not through positive thinking, but through genuine understanding that consciousness, not matter, determined her experience. She had unbound death and bound life. Within 2 months, every test showed complete remission. The doctors called it spontaneous. Goldsmith called it demonstration. The woman lived another 23 years, not in fear of recurrence, but in the freedom of understanding. She had learned the secret. What you bind in consciousness must manifest in experience. She kept binding spiritual truth, and her body continued reflecting that inner binding. This is not exceptional. This is the law operating as designed. Another case involved a businessman facing bankruptcy. Everything on paper confirmed his failure. Debts exceeded assets 3-to-1. Legal deadlines approached. He came to Goldsmith desperate for a miracle. Instead, Goldsmith taught him about binding and loosing. The man needed to unbind his acceptance of failure and bind the truth of infinite spiritual supply. For 2 weeks, the man practiced, not denying his circumstances, but refusing to bind them as ultimate reality. He unbound his agreement with lack. He bound his consciousness to the truth that spirit's abundance knows no limitation. He stopped empowering the appearance and started establishing spiritual truth as his operating system. Nothing changed externally for 13 days. On the 14th day, 3 unexpected opportunities arrived within hours. A forgotten investment matured. A business contact offered partnership. A legal technicality eliminated half the debt. Within 90 days, complete financial restoration. The man had learned that binding truth in consciousness must produce corresponding earthly demonstration. He continued this practice and built lasting prosperity. Goldsmith emphasized that this is not magic or manipulation. This is spiritual law operating with precision. When you bind truth in consciousness, you align with the infinite creative power that governs all existence. When you bind falsehood, limitation, or fear, you cut yourself off from that power and experience the darkness of separated consciousness. The profound part is that you are always binding something. Your consciousness never stops creating your experience based on what you accept as real. Most people unconsciously bind negativity, limitation, and fear simply through habit and social conditioning. They wonder why life feels hard. They have bound hardness as reality through unconscious agreement. The transformation happens when you become conscious of this binding power and use it deliberately. You begin examining what you have bound as true. You start questioning whether your accepted beliefs serve your highest good. You practice unbinding old patterns and binding spiritual truth instead. This is the work. This is the path. This is how heaven manifests on earth. Here is what Joel Goldsmith proved repeatedly. The moment you genuinely bind spiritual truth in consciousness, the corresponding earthly demonstration must follow. Not might follow, must follow. Because consciousness is cause and the material world is effect. Change the cause, and the effect has no choice but to reorganize accordingly. This is immutable spiritual law. You possess this power right now. Every thought you entertain, every belief you accept, every conviction you hold is binding something in your experience. The question is not whether you will bind, but what you will bind. Will you continue unconsciously binding limitation, or will you consciously bind the truth that sets you free? Start today with one area of concern. Identify what you have bound as real. Disease, lack, conflict. Then consciously unbind your agreement with that condition. Establish spiritual truth instead. Bind the reality that God is the only power, that spirit governs all, that consciousness creates experience. Practice this daily. Watch what happens. If these transformation principles resonate with your spirit, like this video to help others discover Joel Goldsmith's wisdom. Subscribe for more consciousness teachings that actually work. and comment which limiting belief you are ready to unbind right now. Beyond the main binding practice, Goldsmith taught complementary techniques that accelerate transformation. The first is what he called the practice of resting in God. When you rest in spiritual consciousness, you stop trying to force demonstrations and allow the bound truth to naturally manifest. Force indicates you have not truly bound the truth, but are still struggling with doubt. True binding produces rest. When you genuinely establish spiritual truth in consciousness, effort ceases. You know the demonstration must appear because you have aligned with the creative power itself. This rest is not passivity. It is confident expectation based on understanding spiritual law. You have done the inner work of binding truth. Now you rest in that binding and let it unfold. Practice this. After binding spiritual truth about any situation, deliberately rest. Stop mentally working the problem. Stop checking for results. Simply rest in your inner knowing that consciousness creates experience and you have established the right cause. This rest itself becomes evidence that your binding was genuine. Doubt cannot rest. Understanding can do nothing but rest. The second complementary technique is what Goldsmith called watching. You watch your thoughts like a guardian, immediately catching any attempt to unbind spiritual truth and rebind limitation. The mind has been conditioned for decades to bind negativity. It will try to return to old patterns. Your job is vigilant watching without strain or tension. When fear thoughts arise suggesting the old condition still has power, you gently unbind them. When doubt whispers that nothing is changing, you recognize this as an attempt to rebind limitation. You do not fight these thoughts. You simply refuse them your agreement. You have bound spiritual truth, and you maintain that binding through gentle, persistent watching. This watching becomes easier with practice. Initially, you may need to correct your thoughts dozens of times daily. Within weeks, the corrections decrease. Your consciousness begins naturally maintaining the binding of truth without constant effort. This is the formation of spiritual consciousness, where truth becomes your automatic operating system rather than limitation. The third technique Goldsmith emphasized is living from the invisible. Most people live from the visible, letting appearances dictate their inner state. When appearances seem negative, they bind negativity. When appearances seem positive, they bind positivity. This keeps them trapped in the material realm where circumstances control consciousness instead of consciousness controlling circumstances. Living from the invisible means maintaining your binding of spiritual truth regardless of what the material world currently shows. You understand that the visible is always past tense, the result of previous consciousness. Your current binding determines future visible demonstrations. Therefore, you refuse to let current appearances unbind the truth you have established within. This is advanced practice but essential for consistent demonstration. When the bank account looks empty, you continue binding abundance truth. When the body shows symptoms, you continue binding spiritual wholeness. When relationships seem broken, you continue binding divine harmony. You live from the invisible truth you have bound, and the visible must eventually conform because consciousness is senior to matter. The fourth complementary practice is what Goldsmith called the practice of immediacy. Many people bind truth but project its demonstration into the future. They think, this will work eventually, someday I will be healed, in time my supply will come. This future projection actually unbinds the truth by agreeing that limitation has power right now. True binding recognizes that spiritual reality exists in its fullness immediately, not tomorrow, not after you prove yourself worthy. Right now, in this present moment, the truth you bind is already complete in consciousness. Your work is recognizing present perfection, not creating future improvement. When you bind health, you bind it as now. When you bind supply, you bind it as already established. This immediacy collapses time in your experience. Demonstrations that might take months through future-focused consciousness often appear within days or weeks through immediate recognition. You are not waiting for God to act. You are recognizing that God has already established all perfection in spiritual consciousness. Your binding makes you aware of what already is. This changes everything about how quickly transformation occurs. Every person attempting this work encounters specific challenges. The first and most common is the weight of physical evidence. When you bind health but the body still shows symptoms, doubt crashes in like a wave. The symptoms seem more real than your inner binding. This is where most people abandon the practice and rebind the material condition as ultimate reality. Goldsmith taught that appearances have no power except what you give them through agreement. Yes, the symptoms appear. Yes, the lack seems evident. Yes, the problem looks unchanged. But these are effects of past consciousness. Your new binding has not yet had time to manifest visibly. The challenge is maintaining your binding despite contrary evidence, knowing that consciousness always wins over matter eventually. The solution is understanding lag time. Physical reality does not instantly reorganize the moment you bind new truth. There is a period where the old manifestation persists while the new binding works invisibly. This lag time tests your conviction. If you rebind the limitation because nothing seems to change quickly, you abort the demonstration. Persistence through the lag time is essential for success. The second major challenge is social pressure. When you tell people you are binding spiritual truth for healing or supply, many respond with skepticism or concern. They mean well, but their doubt can shake your conviction if you allow it. They insist you face reality, accept the facts, be reasonable. What they call reality is actually limited perception treating effect as cause. Goldsmith experienced this constantly. Medical professionals questioned his methods. Religious authorities challenged his interpretations. Even students sometimes doubted. His response was consistent. I am not asking you to believe my words. I am asking you to test the principle in your own consciousness. Bind truth and watch what happens. Let demonstration be your evidence, not human opinion. The practical solution is practicing in silence initially. Do not announce your binding work to skeptical audiences. Establish your inner conviction first. Let some demonstrations occur. Once you have personal proof that binding consciousness creates experience, others' opinions lose their power to disturb you. You know what you know through direct experience. That knowing cannot be shaken by those who have never tested the principle. The third challenge is inconsistency. You bind truth powerfully in the morning, then unbind it through worry by afternoon. You establish spiritual reality during meditation, then re-establish material limitation through fear-based conversations. This binding and unbinding creates confused consciousness that produces mixed, unreliable demonstrations. You get partial results that neither fully succeed nor completely fail. Goldsmith compared this to trying to go north and south simultaneously. You end up nowhere. Consistent binding produces consistent demonstration. Inconsistent binding produces chaos. The challenge is catching yourself in the act of unbinding and immediately re-establishing truth. This requires the watching practice mentioned earlier, but applied specifically to consistency of consciousness throughout the day. The solution is creating consciousness checkpoints. Several times daily, pause and examine what you currently have bound as real. If you discover you have drifted back into binding limitation, immediately unbind it and re-establish truth. Do this without self-criticism. Simply correct course the moment you notice drift. Over weeks, these checkpoints train your consciousness to maintain consistent binding naturally without constant monitoring. The fourth challenge is confusing binding with affirmation. Many people repeat positive statements without changing their actual binding. They say God is my supply while still binding lack as reality in their consciousness. They affirm perfect health while still binding the diagnosis as ultimate truth. The words say one thing, the consciousness binds another. Results match the binding, not the words. True binding is deeper than verbal affirmation. It is the silent establishment of truth as your foundational conviction, your operating reality, your unshakable knowing. You can tell when you have genuinely bound truth because effort ceases. You are not trying to convince yourself. You simply know. This knowing produces rest, confidence, and patient expectation rather than anxious hoping. The solution is checking your inner state. When you claim to have bound truth, do you feel peaceful or anxious? Does the thought of checking material conditions disturb you or feel irrelevant? True binding produces detachment from appearances because you know consciousness determines experience. If you feel desperate for visible proof, you have not yet genuinely bound the truth, but are still hoping it might become true. If these challenge-breaking insights are expanding your understanding, like to support this transformative content, Subscribe for advanced Joel Goldsmith teachings, and comment which of these 4 challenges you recognize in your own spiritual practice right now. Advanced practice involves binding truth not just in crisis but as permanent consciousness. Goldsmith lived in this state. He did not bind health when sick and then forget it when well. He maintained continuous binding of spiritual truth as his operating system. This produced a life largely free from the common disasters that plague human existence because those disasters could not find binding in his consciousness. This is the difference between emergency binding and consciousness transformation. Most people only practice when problems arise. They bind truth under pressure, get their demonstration, then return to unconscious binding of limitation until the next crisis appears. This keeps them on a roller coaster of demonstration and collapse, victory and defeat, healing and recurrence. The advanced path is making spiritual truth your permanent binding regardless of circumstances. You bind God as only power whether facing challenge or enjoying success. You bind spiritual identity whether sick or healthy, poor or prosperous. This consistent binding eventually elevates your entire experience because your consciousness becomes so established in truth that limitation finds no agreement point, no place to bind itself in your awareness. Goldsmith demonstrated this advanced consciousness in practical daily life. He bound spiritual harmony in all relationships, so conflict rarely arose. When it did, it dissolved quickly because his consciousness gave it no sustaining power. He bound infinite supply as permanent reality, so lack never gained foothold regardless of economic conditions. He bound divine guidance as constant, so decisions flowed with unusual clarity and rightness. This was not perfection in the human sense. Goldsmith faced challenges like everyone. The difference was his response. Where most people immediately bind the challenge as powerful reality requiring intense effort to overcome, Goldsmith immediately unbound its claim to power and rebound spiritual truth. This refusal to give problems binding in consciousness meant they appeared smaller, resolved faster, and taught lessons without creating trauma. The practical application is approaching every situation, pleasant or unpleasant, as an opportunity to practice conscious binding. Your car breaks down. Do you bind mechanical failure as disaster, or unbind that agreement and bind divine order? Someone speaks unkindly. Do you bind offense and hurt, or unbind that reaction and bind forgiveness and peace? Every moment offers the choice of what you will bind as real in your consciousness. Another advanced application involves binding truth for others without their knowledge. Goldsmith discovered that when he bound spiritual truth about another person, that person's experience often shifted even though they knew nothing about his inner work. This seems mysterious until you understand that consciousness is one. What you bind for another in genuine spiritual knowing affects the consciousness you share. This is not manipulation or control. You cannot bind anything in another's consciousness against their will, but you can refuse to bind their limitation as ultimate reality. When someone comes to you sick, you can unbind your agreement with their sickness and bind their spiritual perfection instead. When someone seems trapped in poverty, you can unbind your seeing them that way and bind their connection to infinite supply. This practice requires purity of motive. You are not trying to make people into what you want them to be. You are recognizing what they truly are in spiritual reality and refusing to bind the limited appearance as truth. Often this inner work produces surprising changes in their experience because your consciousness no longer reinforces their limitation. You have withdrawn your agreement from their problem, and that withdrawal removes supporting energy. The highest advanced practice Goldsmith taught is binding heaven on earth as permanent condition. Not just healing this sickness or solving that problem, but establishing your consciousness so completely in spiritual truth that your entire experience becomes what he called heaven manifest. Problems still appear, but they lose their power to disturb because they find no binding in consciousness that treats them as ultimate reality. This does not happen through a single decision. It develops through years of consistent practice, binding truth in situation after situation until spiritual consciousness becomes your natural state. You gradually shift from someone who occasionally practices binding truth to someone whose consciousness is bound to truth as permanent reality. The difference produces dramatically different life experiences. People who met Goldsmith late in life reported a quality about him that transcended normal human existence. Peace that circumstances could not shake. Joy independent of external conditions. Wisdom that seemed to flow without effort. This was not personality. This was consciousness so bound to spiritual truth that heaven's reality had become his earthly experience. This is the promise available to anyone willing to practice until binding truth becomes their automatic state. As we approach the completion of this teaching, understand that you now possess knowledge that most people live entire lifetimes without discovering. The principle of binding and loosing is the master key that unlocks every spiritual teaching, every healing testimony, every demonstration of supply or harmony. Everything works through this single principle. Consciousness creates experience based on what it binds as real. You are not powerless. You have never been powerless. You possess the same authority Jesus spoke about when he revealed this principle. What you bind on earth through your consciousness will be bound in heaven, meaning it must manifest in your experience because consciousness and experience are one continuous reality. Matter serves consciousness, never the other way around. The question now is what you will do with this understanding. Will you return to unconscious binding of limitation, fear, and lack? Or will you begin the deliberate practice of unbinding old patterns and binding spiritual truth until it becomes your permanent consciousness? The choice determines whether you live in earth's darkness or heaven's light, and that choice is entirely yours to make. Goldsmith spent his final years emphasizing that this teaching is not about acquiring anything external. It is about recognizing what already exists in spiritual consciousness and binding yourself to that eternal reality rather than temporary material appearances. Heaven is not created by your binding. Heaven already exists as the realm of spiritual truth. Your binding simply makes you aware of it and allows it to become your lived experience. This removes all strain from the practice. You are not trying to manifest something that does not exist. You are recognizing what eternally exists and withdrawing your agreement from the illusion of separation, limitation, and lack. Every time you unbind a false belief and bind spiritual truth, you take one step out of darkness into light. Each step makes the next step easier until walking in light becomes natural. Start where you are with what concerns you most right now. Apply the binding principle to that specific situation. Unbind your agreement with the problem. Bind the spiritual truth that applies to that area. Practice consistently through the lag time until demonstration appears. Let that success build your confidence to apply the principle more broadly until your entire consciousness undergoes transformation from bound limitation to bound freedom. The spiritual journey is not about becoming something you are not. It is about unbinding false identity and binding true identity. You are not material being trying to become spiritual. You are spiritual consciousness that has temporarily bound itself to material identity. Every limitation you experience comes from that false binding. Every freedom you seek already exists in the spiritual identity you have forgotten. Goldsmith's entire ministry aimed at this single realization. You are consciousness, not body. You are spirit, not matter. You are eternal, not temporary. When you bind this truth about yourself, everything changes because you have shifted from identifying with effect to identifying with cause. Effect is powerless. Cause is all-powerful. You have always been cause, but you bound yourself to effect through misunderstanding. This is the ultimate binding work. Binding your identity to spiritual truth rather than material appearance. When you genuinely know yourself as consciousness rather than body, as spirit rather than flesh, as eternal rather than mortal, the entire game changes. Problems that once seemed overwhelming become opportunities to demonstrate spiritual authority. Limitations that once defined you become evidence of old binding ready to be released through new understanding. You now understand what happens when you truly grasp that what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. You recognize that your consciousness is the binding force creating your experience. You see that every condition in your life exists because you have bound something as real through agreement, attention, or acceptance. And you know that you possess the power to unbind old patterns and bind spiritual truth instead. This is not the end of teaching, but the beginning of practice. Goldsmith proved this principle works through decades of consistent demonstration. Thousands of students proved it works through their own healings and transformations. Now it is your turn to prove it. Not by believing these words, but by testing the principle in your own consciousness and watching what happens in your experience. Bind truth today, unbind limitation today. Practice consistently through challenges and doubts. Watch for demonstrations. Learn from setbacks. Refine your understanding. Keep binding truth until it becomes your permanent consciousness. This is the path Goldsmith walked. This is the path he invites you to walk. What you bind in consciousness today determines what you experience tomorrow. Bind wisely. Bind truth. Bind heaven. And watch heaven become your earthly reality. If this complete teaching has transformed your understanding of spiritual power, like this video so others can discover these life-changing principles. Subscribe for more profound Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment, "I am binding truth," to declare your commitment to this practice right now.